Sometimes the most important person at a wedding isn't the one standing at the altar. Sometimes it's the stranger who can't stop looking at you. I didn't notice him at first, and honestly, why would I? Weddings have a way of swallowing everyone into the same blur of polished shoes, nervous smiles, and relatives pretending they aren't secretly judging each other. My cousin Emma had chosen an old vineyard just outside Asheville for her ceremony, the kind of place with white wooden fences, rolling hills, and enough string lights to make even the daylight seem romantic. I had been hired to take a few candid photos before the professional photographer arrived, which meant I spent most of the afternoon hiding behind my camera instead of making awkward conversation with family members I only saw every few years. That was always easier. Looking through a lens made the world quieter. People smiled without expecting anything from me afterward. I was adjusting the focus on a bouquet resting beside the front row when I felt it. That strange sensation everyone talks about, but rarely admits is real. The unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. I lowered the camera just enough to glance across the garden. Standing beside the groom was the best man. Tall, clean-cut, navy suit tailored perfectly, dark hair catching the afternoon sun. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't checking his phone. He was simply looking at me. Not in a rude way. Not even in an obvious way. Just watching, like he had suddenly remembered something important and couldn't quite believe it was standing 20 feet away. The moment our eyes met, he looked down with the faintest smile before helping straighten the groom's tie as though nothing had happened. Weird. I shrugged it off. Maybe he recognized me from somewhere. Maybe I reminded him of an old coworker. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me at all. Human beings are surprisingly good at inventing stories to avoid uncomfortable possibilities. The ceremony began, soft piano music floating across the vineyard while guests settled into their seats. I slipped toward the back, quietly capturing little moments everyone else overlooked. Emma, squeezing her father's hand before they walked down the aisle. A flower girl trying to keep a butterfly from landing on her dress. My uncle pretending not to wipe away tears. Those were the photographs people treasured years later. Not perfect poses. Honest moments. I lifted my camera again and accidentally framed the best man instead. He wasn't watching the bride. He wasn't watching the groom. He was watching me. This time there was no mistake. Our eyes met through the camera lens, and instead of looking embarrassed, he gave the smallest nod, almost like greeting someone he already knew. My finger froze over the shutter button. I had never seen this man in my life. At least, I didn't think I had. The ceremony continued, applause erupted as the newlyweds kissed, and everyone rose to celebrate. Guests poured toward the reception hall, laughter replacing quiet anticipation. I stayed behind for another minute, gathering my camera bag while the vineyard slowly emptied. Footsteps crunched across the gravel behind me. I turned, expecting one of my cousins asking for another family picture. Instead, it was him. The best man stopped a few feet away, hands tucked casually into his pockets, his expression calm but strangely relieved, as though reaching me had taken more courage than walking down the aisle. Before I could introduce myself, before I could even ask why he kept looking at me all afternoon, he smiled gently and said, "You probably don't remember me." For a second, I searched his face, hoping memory would suddenly appear like an old photograph developing in slow motion. Nothing. I would have remembered someone like him. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue, calm without being distant, and there was something almost familiar about the way he smiled, as if he had already expected my confusion. I let out a quiet laugh. "I am sorry," I admitted. "Should I?" He shook his head gently, almost relieved by my answer. "No, I did not really expect you to." Before either of us could say anything else, someone called his name from across the courtyard. "Adrian, we need you for family pictures." He glanced over his shoulder before looking back at me. "Looks like I have to disappear again." He hesitated for the briefest moment. "I hope we get another chance to talk." Then he walked away, leaving me standing beside the rows of empty ceremony chairs with more questions than answers. The reception hall buzzed with music, clinking glasses, and conversations that overlapped into one cheerful blur. Emma had always loved bringing people together, and somehow she had managed to seat complete strangers at every table while convincing everyone it had been intentional. Naturally, my place card sat directly beside Adrian's. I stared at the neatly printed name for a second before looking around the table. My aunt grinned far too knowingly. "Lucky coincidence," she said with a wink that made absolutely no sense. I slid into my chair just as Adrian arrived, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. I was not sure if you wanted one, he said. So I grabbed an extra. Thank you. I accepted the glass, still trying to understand why this man acted like we were continuing a conversation instead of starting one. Dinner arrived, speeches began, and every few minutes I caught Adrian smiling at something I said, even when I was talking to someone else. It was not the exaggerated grin people wear to be polite. It was softer than that, quieter, like he genuinely enjoyed watching me exist. Oddly enough, it did not make me uncomfortable anymore. It simply made me curious. During dessert, Emma's younger brother rushed over carrying a small cardboard box. Emergency, he announced dramatically. The guest book pens are missing. Noah, since you are always paying attention to details, can you help me look? Before I could answer, Adrian stood up. I will help too. We searched through storage closets, empty conference rooms, and every decorated hallway in the venue. The missing pins turned out to be sitting exactly where someone had left them beside the welcome sign 20 minutes earlier. The entire mission had been unnecessary, but neither of us seemed eager to rush back. We ended up stepping outside onto the wide wooden porch overlooking the vineyard. Evening had settled across the hills, and hundreds of tiny string lights shimmered overhead like stars that had decided to come closer. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and blooming lavender. Adrian rested his hands on the porch railing. You still carry your camera everywhere, he said quietly. I frowned. How do you know that? His expression did not change, but I noticed him take a slow breath before answering. Because the last time I saw you, you were holding one then too. The words settled between us with surprising weight. I searched every corner of my memory again, determined this time to find something, anything, that connected us. But all I found was the growing certainty that whatever story Adrian carried had started years before I even knew he existed. Adrian looked toward the vineyard before speaking again, almost as if the memory belonged more to the landscape than to him. 5 years ago, there was a charity art festival in Charleston, he said. There was a photography exhibit in one of the old brick warehouses downtown. I blinked. Charleston. I had shown a small collection there right after college, back when I still believed every exhibit would magically launch my career. It had been one weekend among dozens of forgettable freelance jobs. I was there, I admitted slowly. Adrian smiled, and for the first time that evening, I saw genuine relief soften his face. I know. My mind raced through countless visitors who had wandered past my photographs, nodded politely, and disappeared forever. You bought one of my prints? I guessed. He laughed quietly. No, I could not afford one. That answer somehow made me even more curious. Music drifted from the reception hall behind us, followed by a wave of laughter as someone began another wedding toast. Neither of us moved. The evening air had turned cooler, and tiny lights stretched across the vineyard like glowing ribbons above our heads. I almost did not walk into that exhibit, Adrian continued. I had been having a terrible week at work. Everything felt like it was moving in the wrong direction. I only stepped inside because it started raining. He paused for a moment before looking at me again. There was one photograph that stopped me. My heartbeat quickened for reasons I could not explain. Over the years, I had taken thousands of photographs. Some won small local awards. Most disappeared into forgotten hard drives. I could not imagine one becoming unforgettable to a stranger. Which one? I asked. Instead of answering directly, Adrian tilted his head with a thoughtful smile. Do you remember the old man sitting alone on a wooden dock at sunrise? The image appeared in my memory instantly. An elderly fisherman wrapped in a faded blue jacket, holding a coffee mug while watching the lake wake up beneath a pale orange sky. I had almost deleted that photograph because I thought it was too quiet, too ordinary. I remember, I whispered. Adrian nodded. I stood in front of it for almost 20 minutes. I laughed awkwardly. That is a long time to stare at one picture. It was the first peaceful thing I had seen in months. His voice remained calm, but there was a weight beneath every word that made me stop smiling. The description beside the frame said something I have never forgotten. I frowned. I barely remembered writing those little cards for the exhibit. What did it say? Adrian looked out across the rows of grapevines before repeating the sentence from memory. Some mornings do not ask you to have all the answers. They only ask you to stay long enough to see the sun come up. My chest tightened. I had written those words at 2 o'clock in the morning while rushing to finish the display cards. They had never seemed particularly important. Yet Adrian spoke them with the quiet certainty of someone reciting a favorite passage from an old book. I searched his expression, trying to understand how a single forgotten sentence had remained with him for half a decade. Before I could ask another question, Emma's voice echoed from the porch doorway. "There you two are? The photographer wants every guest outside for a giant group picture before it gets too dark." Adrian stepped back with an apologetic smile. "Looks like our conversation has to wait." As we walked side by side toward the lawn, I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, suddenly realizing the mystery was no longer why he kept looking at me. The real mystery was how someone I had never remembered had carried a small piece of my life with him for 5 years, while I had unknowingly walked past the memory every single day. The giant group photo turned into exactly the kind of cheerful chaos every family secretly enjoyed. Children wandered out of frame at the worst possible moment. Grandparents argued over who should stand in the front row, and someone kept insisting the family dog deserved a place in the picture. I stood near the edge of the crowd with my camera hanging from my shoulder while the hired photographer tried to organize nearly 80 people into something that vaguely resembled order. Every few seconds I caught Adrian looking my way again. Only now it felt different. The mystery had shifted. His attention no longer made me self-conscious. Instead, it pulled at my curiosity like a half-remembered melody I could not quite place. After the third attempt, the photographer finally captured a version that satisfied everyone, and applause broke out as though we had accomplished something much greater than standing still for 10 seconds. Guests drifted back toward the reception hall where the band had already started playing classic songs that every wedding somehow included. Emma caught my arm before I could disappear with the crowd. "Noah, would you do me one tiny favor?" she asked with the unmistakable smile that meant the favor would not be tiny at all. "The welcome table is missing one of the framed engagement photos. I think somebody accidentally carried it into the old wine cellar while decorating this morning. Could you grab it?" Before I answered, Adrian stepped beside us. "I know where the cellar entrance is. I can help." Emma clapped her hands together. "Perfect. You two are lifesavers." The cellar sat beneath the main reception building, reached by a narrow staircase tucked behind the catering kitchen. The sounds of laughter and music faded with every step downward until only the soft hum of old refrigeration units remained. The space smelled faintly of oak barrels, polished stone, and cool earth. Wooden shelves stretched along the walls, lined with bottles waiting for celebrations that had not happened yet. A single lamp glowed near the storage room at the far end of the corridor. "It should be somewhere in here," Adrian said, opening the partially closed door. Boxes of decorations filled the room from floor to ceiling. Lanterns, folded tablecloths, spare chairs, and unopened flower vases stood stacked in careful rows. We searched quietly, occasionally moving a box or checking behind a crate. "Found it," I called after spotting the silver frame resting beside a basket of unused candles. I picked it up carefully and smiled at the photograph of Emma and Lucas laughing on the Vineyard Hill months before the wedding. Just as I turned toward the doorway, the lights flickered once, then twice. A low rumble echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy rain striking the roof overhead. Somewhere beyond the storage room, a solid wooden door closed with a deep thud. Adrian frowned and walked into the hallway. He reached for the handle leading back to the staircase and pulled gently. Nothing happened. He tried again with a little more force before letting out a quiet sigh. I think the storm triggered the automatic safety lock. I joined him, listening as rain drummed steadily above us. Oddly enough, I did not panic. The hallway remained brightly lit, the air comfortably cool, and I knew someone upstairs would eventually notice we were missing. Still, the unexpected silence wrapped around us like a pause the world had deliberately created. Adrian rested one hand against the old wooden railing and looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn all afternoon. "Maybe," he said with a soft smile, "this is finally enough time for me to tell you the part of the story I have never told anyone else." Adrian leaned against the cool stone wall, listening to the rain tapping steadily above us. It sounded less like a storm and more like the world politely asking everyone upstairs to leave us alone for a little while. He folded his arms, searching for the right words with the same careful attention I usually reserved for adjusting the focus on a difficult photograph. I have rehearsed this conversation in my head more times than I can count, he admitted with a quiet laugh. It never sounded right. I rested the framed engagement picture safely on a nearby crate before sitting on one of the unopened storage boxes. You have already waited 5 years, I said. I think I can wait another minute. He smiled at that. 5 years ago, I was not having a bad week. I told you that earlier because it was easier. The truth is, I was questioning everything. My career, my future, the person I was trying so hard to become. His eyes drifted toward the rows of wine bottles lining the hallway. Everyone around me seemed to know exactly where they were going. I had the job everyone congratulated me for getting. I wore expensive suits. I smiled through networking events. I kept telling myself that if I worked harder, eventually I would feel successful. He let out a slow breath. Instead, I just felt invisible. I stayed silent, sensing he needed someone to listen more than someone to answer. That afternoon, I wandered into your photography exhibit because I wanted somewhere quiet before driving home. I did not know who you were. I had never heard your name. Then I saw that photograph of the old fisherman. His voice softened as though he were standing in front of it again. Everyone else walked past it. They stopped at the colorful city skylines or dramatic landscapes. But that photograph, he smiled to himself. It was peaceful without trying to impress anyone. It reminded me that ordinary moments could still matter. I looked down at my hands. I had almost left that image out of the exhibit because I thought no one would notice it. When I read your description underneath, something shifted. Adrian continued. Not all at once. It was small, but sometimes small changes last the longest. The room fell quiet except for the steady rain. I started carrying that sentence with me, he said. Whenever work became overwhelming or I felt like I was falling behind everyone else, I remembered those words about staying long enough to see the sun come up. You have no idea how often they helped me. I shook my head in disbelief. I wrote that because I needed to hear it myself. Adrian looked genuinely surprised. Really? I nodded. Back then I was struggling too. Photography was not paying the bills. I was sleeping on my friend's couch. I almost canceled that exhibit because I thought nobody would care. We both laughed quietly at the strange symmetry of it. Two strangers standing in the same room years apart, each believing they were the only one who felt lost. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully unfolded something protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. It was an old exhibition brochure, slightly faded around the edges from years of being carried from place to place. Across the front, beside one of my photographs, was my handwritten signature from the closing day of the exhibit. I kept this, he said almost apologetically, not because I expected to meet you again. I just wanted to remember the day everything inside me started changing. I stared at the worn brochure, suddenly realizing that while I had forgotten an ordinary weekend from 5 years ago, someone else had quietly built an entirely different chapter of his life around a few photographs and a sentence I had nearly erased before printing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The faded brochure rested carefully between us, protected inside its worn plastic sleeve as though it were something far more valuable than paper. I traced the edge of my old signature with my eyes and shook my head in quiet disbelief. I cannot believe you carried this around all these years. Adrian smiled with a hint of embarrassment. There were times I thought about throwing it away because it felt ridiculous. Then another difficult day would come along, and somehow I could never do it. Before I could answer, the overhead lights flickered again. Somewhere upstairs, voices echoed faintly through the old floorboards, followed by the muffled sound of someone trying the cellar door. Adrian called out, and a familiar voice answered that the maintenance manager was resetting the automatic lock after the storm briefly interrupted the power. Give us 5 minutes, someone shouted. The system is almost back online. Adrian laughed softly. Apparently, the universe thinks I still have something left to say. I leaned back against the stone wall, feeling strangely comfortable despite the unexpected delay. Then say it. He nodded slowly. After that exhibit, I started paying attention to things I had ignored before. I stopped measuring my life against everyone else's. I took weekends off instead of living at the office. I even volunteered at a community legal clinic because I remembered something else you had written beside another photograph. My eyebrows lifted. There was another sentence. You wrote that kindness is rarely dramatic. Most of the time it looks like simply showing up. I laughed quietly. I really was writing notes to myself back then. Maybe, Adrian replied. But they reached other people too. The hallway grew peaceful again, filled only with the gentle rhythm of rain and the faint aroma of oak barrels aging beneath the vineyard. It felt impossible that only a few hours earlier Adrian had been nothing more than the best man standing beside the groom. Now it felt as though we were uncovering chapters of the same story that had somehow been written separately. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. If those photographs meant so much, why did you never contact me?" Adrian looked down at the brochure before answering. "I tried. That caught me completely off guard." "What do you mean?" "The gallery told me you had moved. Your website disappeared a few months later. I found an old social media account, but it had not been updated in years. Life kept moving. My job transferred me twice. Eventually, I convinced myself that some people are only supposed to change your life from a distance." I stared at him, trying to process the idea that our paths had almost crossed more than once without either of us knowing. "And today?" I asked quietly. A warm smile spread across his face. "Today I walked into the groom's suite to straighten my tie before the ceremony. One of the ushers mentioned that Emma's cousin was a photographer helping with candid pictures. Then I saw you through the window holding your camera exactly the way you had in Charleston." He laughed under his breath. I honestly wondered if I was imagining things. My own smile appeared before I realized it. "So, that is why you kept looking at me." "I kept looking because I wanted to be absolutely certain it was really you." At that exact moment, a loud click echoed through the hallway. The heavy cellar door unlocked, and warm light from the staircase spilled across the stone floor. Someone upstairs called that everything was working again and the newlyweds were about to cut the cake. Adrian picked up the framed engagement photo while I slipped the old brochure carefully back into his waiting hand. As we started walking toward the stairs together, I realized something unexpected. The mystery that had begun with a stranger's lingering glance had quietly become something else entirely. For the first time all evening, I was the one who could not stop looking at him. The reception had somehow grown even livelier while we were downstairs. The band had switched to upbeat classics that coaxed even the most stubborn relatives onto the dance floor. Children darted between tables with slices of wedding cake balanced dangerously in their hands, and the rain outside only made the warm glow inside the reception hall feel more inviting. Adrian and I stepped through the doors carrying the framed engagement photo, only to be greeted by Emma, who let out an exaggerated sigh of relief. "There you are," she laughed. "Half the family thought the two of you got lost in the wine cellar." Before either of us could explain, Lucas walked over with a grin that looked far too amused. Or maybe they just wanted a little peace and quiet. The teasing drew a chorus of playful comments from nearby cousins. My face warmed immediately. "We were looking for the missing picture," I protested, lifting the frame like evidence in a courtroom. Emma accepted it with a dramatic nod. "Convenient excuse." Adrian chuckled beside me, and instead of correcting anyone, he simply smiled. Oddly enough, I did not rush to deny the assumptions either. The conversation drifted away as quickly as it had started, but something subtle had changed. For the rest of the evening, people naturally grouped us together. When the photographer organized another round of casual pictures, someone automatically called for Adrian to stand beside me. When fresh coffee arrived after dessert, my aunt handed 2 cups to me and casually said, "Take one to your friend." It was all completely innocent, yet every small moment made the distance between us feel shorter than it had been only an hour earlier. Later, while the newlyweds shared their first dance beneath hundreds of glowing lights, Adrian and I found ourselves standing near the edge of the dance floor. We watched Emma laugh as Lucas accidentally missed one of the dance steps before both of them dissolved into laughter instead of embarrassment. "That is my favorite part of weddings," Adrian said. "Not when everything is perfect. When people stop trying to be." I glanced at him. "You notice little things too." He smiled. "Maybe that is your fault." His answer lingered in my thoughts longer than I expected. The evening unfolded naturally after that. We talked about ordinary things that somehow felt surprisingly important. My tiny photography studio in Asheville, his law office in Charlotte, my habit of driving without a destination whenever I needed new ideas, his weekend volunteer work helping families prepare legal paperwork they could not otherwise afford. There were no dramatic confessions, no grand declarations, just the comfortable rhythm of 2 people discovering they had been speaking the same emotional language for years without ever meeting. At one point, the band invited everyone to join a slow group dance. I immediately stepped backward. "Absolutely not," I laughed. I photograph weddings. I do not dance at them. Adrian raised one eyebrow with playful confidence. That sounds suspiciously like fear. It is self-awareness. I think it is fear. Before I could invent another excuse, Emma appeared behind me with impeccable timing and gently nudged my shoulder. Noah, humor the best man for one song. It is my wedding. Consider it an official family request. I looked at Adrian, who extended his hand without the slightest pressure, giving me every opportunity to refuse. Instead, I surprised myself by placing my hand in his. The music floated softly through the hall as we joined the other guests beneath the string lights. We did not dance particularly well, and neither of us seemed to care. We laughed whenever we stepped in the wrong direction, quietly apologized at exactly the same time more than once, and somehow ended up smiling so much that my cheeks actually began to ache. Somewhere between the music, the laughter, and the gentle glow of the evening, I realized something that caught me completely off guard. I no longer felt as though I had just met Adrian Brooks. Somehow, impossibly, it felt as though life had simply taken 5 years longer than necessary to introduce us properly. The song ended far sooner than I wanted it to. Around us, the dance floor erupted into applause as the band thanked everyone for joining in, but neither Adrian nor I stepped away immediately. We both laughed at the awkward realization that we were still standing there long after the music had faded. I think we survived, I joked. Barely, Adrian replied. Although I stepped on your shoe at least twice. 3 times, I corrected. I was being generous. He smiled in that quiet way that had somehow become familiar in the span of a single evening. The reception slowly shifted into its final hours. Older relatives gathered near the coffee station sharing stories from decades ago. Children fell asleep across their parents' shoulders, and the newlyweds moved from table to table thanking every guest personally. It was the kind of ending every good wedding deserved, gentle instead of rushed. I slipped outside for a breath of cool air while the staff began clearing empty plates. The storm had passed completely. The vineyard glistened beneath a cloudless sky, every vine sparkling with tiny drops of rain that reflected the string lights hanging overhead. Somewhere beyond the hills, a chorus of crickets filled the silence. I rested my elbows against the white fence, breathing in the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. A few moments later, I heard familiar footsteps behind me. I had a feeling you would be out here, Adrian said. I smiled without turning around. How? Because earlier you told me you drive without a destination whenever you need to think. This feels like the walking version of that. I laughed softly. You? Pay attention. To you? Yes. His answer came so naturally that it took me a second to process it. We stood side by side watching the quiet rows of grapevines disappear into the darkness. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Eventually, Adrian spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than nervous. Do you know what frightened me most today? I shook my head. When I first saw you walking across the lawn with your camera, I almost stayed where I was. I turned toward him. Why? Because I was afraid reality could never match 5 years of imagination. He let out a slow breath before continuing. It is easy to admire someone from a distance. It is much harder to discover who they really are. I studied his expression, expecting uncertainty. Instead, I found quiet honesty. And I asked. A warm smile reached his eyes. You turned out to be kinder than I imagined. Funnier, too. I looked down, suddenly fascinated by the gravel beneath my shoes. Compliments had always made me uncomfortable, especially sincere ones. Adrian gently leaned against the fence beside me. There is something else I should tell you. I glanced back up. All afternoon, everyone assumed I kept looking at you because I recognized you. He smiled. That was true at first. My heartbeat slowed as I waited for him to finish. But after we started talking, that stopped being the reason. The breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from inside the reception hall. Adrian looked toward the glowing windows before meeting my eyes again. I kept looking because every time I looked away, I caught myself hoping you would still be there when I turned back. The words settled quietly between us, carrying no pressure and asking for nothing in return. They were simply honest. I felt myself smiling before I even realized it. You know, I said, when we first met today, I thought your staring was making me nervous. Adrian chuckled. And now? I took a slow breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs. Now I think I would have noticed if you had stopped. Neither of us moved. We simply stood there beneath the lights, smiling at one another with the comfortable certainty that sometimes the most meaningful beginnings do not arrive with fireworks or dramatic speeches. Sometimes they begin with two people finally saying aloud what had quietly been growing between them all day. 1 year later, I found myself standing in front of another vineyard, another aisle lined with white chairs, and another sky so impossibly blue that it almost looked painted. This time I was not carrying my camera, because someone had hired me. I had brought it because I wanted to remember the day the way I always remembered the moments that mattered most. Emma waved enthusiastically from across the lawn, while Lucas balanced 2 paper cups of coffee in one hand and greeted arriving guests with the confidence of someone who had survived his first year of marriage. "Can you believe it has already been a year?" Emma asked, giving me a quick hug. "Not at all," I admitted. "It still feels like yesterday." "That is probably because somebody spent half my wedding staring at you." She grinned mischievously before hurrying away to greet another guest, leaving me laughing to myself. A familiar voice spoke beside me. "She is never going to let that joke go." I turned and saw Adrian adjusting the cuff of his navy suit. Somehow he still looked at me exactly the same way he had that first afternoon. Only now there was no mystery hidden behind his smile. There was recognition, affection, and the quiet comfort that comes from knowing someone has become part of your everyday life. We had spent the past year discovering that the easy conversations from the wedding had never been temporary. Weekend coffee had become Saturday traditions. Long phone calls had become ordinary evenings. Road trips with no destination had become shared adventures instead of solitary escapes. I learned that Adrian still carried old ticket stubs inside books because he liked remembering where he had been. He learned that I still stopped my car whenever beautiful morning light appeared because I could never resist taking one more photograph. Neither of us tried to become someone different. We simply made room for each other inside the lives we already had. The ceremony began, and as everyone settled into their seats, I noticed a young photographer moving quietly around the guests, carefully searching for honest moments instead of perfect poses. It reminded me so much of my younger self that I smiled without realizing it. Adrian leaned closer and whispered, "Do you think somebody in these photographs will accidentally change another person's life someday?" I looked across the lawn where sunlight filtered through the trees exactly the way it had 1 year before. "I hope so," I answered. You never really know which small moment someone else might carry with them. After the ceremony ended, guests gathered for one enormous group photograph. The photographer laughed while trying to organize everyone into neat rows. "Couples together," she called cheerfully. Without thinking, Adrian reached for my hand. It felt so natural that I did not even notice until the photographer smiled and pointed us toward the center of the group. As the camera counted down, I glanced at Adrian instead of the lens. He caught me immediately and laughed. "You were supposed to look at the camera." "I know," I replied, "but I would rather look at you." The shutter clicked before either of us could look away. Months later, when the finished photograph arrived in the mail, everyone admired the happy newlyweds standing proudly in the center. My favorite part was hidden off to the side. 2 ordinary men smiling at each other instead of the camera, completely unaware that someone had quietly captured the exact moment they both understood the same simple truth. Sometimes the most extraordinary love stories do not begin because 2 people find each other. Sometimes they begin because one person creates something kind without expecting anything in return. Another person carries that kindness through the hardest seasons of life, and years later, when the timing is finally right, both of them discover they have been walking toward the same sunrise all along.